I stood in the marble foyer of the Ashworth family mansion, watching my stepmother Elena's face drain of color as the lawyer repeated the terms of Great Aunt Cordelia's will for the third time. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching like an eternity as the full implications of what he'd just read sank into their minds. The entire estate, including Ashworth Pharmaceuticals, all real properties, investment portfolios, and liquid assets totaling approximately $800 million, goes to the first blood-related Ashworth descendant to produce a legitimate heir within the next 6 months of my death. The silence that followed was deafening. My father Richard's jaw worked soundlessly, his face cycling through confusion, calculation, and growing horror. My stepsister Miranda's perfectly manicured hands trembled against her designer clutch, her usual mask of superiority cracking like cheap plaster. Eliana looked like she might vomit on her Louboutin heels, her carefully applied makeup starting to smear as perspiration beaded on her forehead. All three of them slowly turned to stare at me, the daughter they'd spent the last 5 years celebrating as barren, defective, a genetic dead end that would never threaten their carefully laid plans. "But Sophia is infertile," Elena whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "The doctors confirmed it multiple times. She can't have children. The tests were conclusive." I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face after years of practiced submission and defeated acceptance. Slowly, deliberately, I placed a protective hand over my barely visible bump beneath my loose cashmere sweater, a bump I'd been carefully concealing for months while watching them make their plans. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and clear in the oppressive silence, "I'm 5 months pregnant. The baby is due in February, well within the 6-month deadline." I paused, savoring the moment I'd been planning for 7 years. "Surprise!" The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers with professional efficiency. "Miss Ashworth, as the only blood descendant of the Ashworth line still of childbearing age, the inheritance is yours upon the birth of your child. The transition paperwork can be prepared immediately. Congratulations." Miranda made a sound like a wounded animal, her hand flying to her throat. "This isn't possible. This has to be some kind of mistake. I'm the heir. I've always been the heir. Father promised." "Miranda is adopted," I said gently, as if explaining something simple to a child. "The will specifically states blood-related Ashworth descendant. You may have taken our name, but you don't carry our DNA." Elena's legs gave out and she sank into one of the antique chairs that had belonged to my grandmother, the chair she'd always told me was too good for someone like me to sit in. Her face had gone completely white, except for two bright red spots on her cheeks, like a fever breaking. "Security will escort you from the premises," Mr. Peterson continued with practiced efficiency. "As of this moment, Mrs. Morrison is the legal owner of this property and all assets contained within. You have 24 hours to collect your personal belongings." "Mrs. Morrison?" Richard spoke for the first time, his voice barely a whisper. James stepped out from behind the tall oak doors where he'd been waiting, my husband of 8 months. My protector, my partner in this elaborate 7-year plan for justice. He was devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit, every inch the heir to the Morrison Hotel empire, and the sight of him still made my heart race even after all this time. "James Morrison," he introduced himself with the slight smile that had charmed socialites and business leaders across 3 continents. "Sophia's husband. We married last spring, though we kept it private until the inheritance was settled. I hope you understand." The sound Elena made was somewhere between a sob and a scream. "You planned this. You planned all of this." "For 7 years, I confirmed, feeling the baby kick as if in approval of finally revealing the truth. "Ever since you killed me the first time." The words slipped out before I could stop them, but the way their faces went from confusion to recognition to absolute terror told me they understood exactly what I meant. Even if they couldn't wrap their minds around reincarnation, they certainly remembered poisoning me in 2019. As security escorted my stunned family from what was now my house, the house where I'd been treated like an unwanted servant for a decade, I couldn't help but think how perfectly this had all worked out. After all, I'd had the entirety of my previous life to plan it, and this time, I knew exactly what kind of monsters I was dealing with. The last thing I remembered from my first life was the taste of bitter almonds and the triumphant smile on Miranda's face as the poison burned through my veins like a liquid fire. I was 28 then, finally about to marry James, the love of my life and heir to the Morrison Hotel fortune. Our wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday. It was going to be a small ceremony, just family and close friends, because I'd still been naive enough to believe that my family wanted me to be happy. I should have known better. I should have seen the signs. You really thought we'd let you marry him? Miranda had laughed as I collapsed in my childhood bedroom, the same room I'd been forced to give up when she moved in. The room that had been converted to storage while I was relegated to the converted maid's quarters in the basement. My body was convulsing, every nerve ending on fire, as whatever she'd put in my tea worked its way through my system. Poor little Sophia, always so naive, so trusting, always believing that people are good deep down. Her laugh was like breaking glass. James was mine from the beginning. We've been together for 2 years. Did you really think someone like him could love someone like you? Eligena had stood in the doorway, watching with the cold satisfaction of a job well done. She was still beautiful at 55, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless even at midnight. She'd always taken such pride in her appearance, in the way men looked at her, in the power she wielded through her beauty and charm. "You were always the obstacle, darling," she'd said, her voice almost gentle, the way she might speak to a beloved pet being put to sleep. Richard's first wife's daughter, the one with the real Ashworth blood, the one who reminded him too much of Margaret. We couldn't let you actually succeed at something for once. My father, my own father, who had once taught me to ride a bike and read me bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, had simply nodded from the hallway. "This is better for everyone, Sophia. Miranda deserves happiness, and well, you were always a disappointment anyway. Margaret would have been disappointed too." Those were the last words I heard before the darkness took me. Not "I love you," or "I'm sorry," or even "goodbye." Just a disappointment. After 28 years of trying to earn his love, trying to be worthy of the family name, trying to make up for the sin of looking too much like the wife he'd lost, I died knowing that I had failed in his eyes. But somehow, impossibly, I woke up. I was 18 again, lying in my narrow bed in the converted basement room where Elena had moved me after marrying my father. The ceiling was low and water-stained, the single window barely large enough to meet building code requirements. The walls were thin enough that I could hear everything that happened in the house above. Every family dinner I wasn't invited to, every celebration I wasn't part of, every conversation about my inadequacies and failures. The date on my cracked phone screen read September 15th, 2012. Exactly 16 years before my death. I had 16 years to plan, and this time, I knew exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. The realization that I had somehow been given a second chance was overwhelming. I spent the first week convinced I was having some kind of elaborate hallucination, that the poison had damaged my brain, and I was imagining this teenage life while dying in that bedroom upstairs. But as the days passed and the details remained consistent, as I watched the same events I remembered from my first life unfold exactly as they had before, I began to accept the impossible truth. I had died, and somehow I had been reborn into my own past. The abuse had started so subtly after Elena entered our lives that I hadn't even recognized it as abuse until it was too late. She'd met my father at a grief counseling group, a beautiful widow with a teenage daughter who needed a father figure. Richard had been lost after my mother's death from cancer, drowning in guilt and sorrow, unable to look at me without seeing Margaret's face. Elena was everything my mother hadn't been. Glamorous, where Margaret had been scholarly, social, where Margaret had been introverted, manipulative, where Margaret had been honest. She swooped into our lives like a beautiful vulture, circling a wounded man and his grieving daughter, and she knew exactly how to position herself as the solution to all our problems. Sophia reminds Richard too much of Margaret, she'd told her friends at the country club, not knowing I was listening from the kitchen where I was helping the catering staff, one of the many jobs she'd assigned me to build character. "It's not healthy for him to see that face every day. The poor man needs space to heal." She convinced my father that I reminded him too much of his dead wife, that it was healthier for me to have independence and responsibility. The master bedroom suite that had been mine since childhood was redecorated for Miranda, while I was moved to the basement room that had once housed our housekeeper. It's better for her to understand her place in the family hierarchy, Elena had explained to my father when he'd expressed mild concern about the move. Miranda is struggling with the transition, and she needs to feel secure in her new home. Sophia is old enough to adapt. I was 14. Miranda was 16 and had lived in a mansion her entire life before her father died, and left them with nothing but debts and a reputation for living beyond their means. The financial abuse escalated gradually. Elena redirected my college fund, the one my mother had carefully built through years of saving and investing, to Miranda's private school tuition and expenses. When I questioned it, Elena produced falsified documents showing that my mother had intended the money for family education expenses, which she interpreted as broadly as possible. Your mother would have wanted you to help your new sister succeed, Elena told me with tears in her eyes, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She always believed in putting family first. When I managed to get into Harvard on my own merit through a combination of exceptional grades and a heartbreaking essay about losing my mother, Elena convinced my father not to help with any expenses because struggle builds character, and she needs to learn independence. I worked 3 jobs to pay for Harvard: tutoring, waitressing, and cleaning offices at night. I studied in bathroom stalls between classes because I couldn't afford to live on campus, and the commute was over an hour each way. My grades suffered, my health suffered, but I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in business and economics. I came home to find that Elena had told everyone in our social circle that I dropped out after freshman year and was working at a diner because I couldn't handle the academic pressure. When I tried to correct the lie, she produced doctored photographs of me in a uniform that looked like it could have been from a restaurant, along with fake transcripts showing failing grades. My father believed her without question. He'd been believing her without question for 4 years by then. I always knew you weren't really college material, he'd said, not even looking up from his newspaper. Your mother was the smart one in the family. You must have gotten my genes. The financial abuse escalated when I turned 21 and legally gained access to my mother's trust fund, except I discovered that Elena had somehow gained power of attorney during my father's darkest period of depression and had transferred everything to Miranda's name. It was what Margaret would have wanted, Elena explained to the lawyer, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She always said that family takes care of family and Miranda is family now. Sophia has always been so independent, so determined to make her own way. Margaret would have wanted to help the daughter who actually needed it. The lawyer said it would take years to fight and cost more than I could afford. Elena had been careful, patient, building a paper trail that supported her version of events. She'd had my father sign documents when he was barely functional with grief and medication. She'd created a narrative of my independence and rejection of family help that made her financial abuse look like respecting my wishes. Every achievement, every relationship, every moment of happiness. They systematically destroyed it all. When I got a promotion at my first job out of college, Elena somehow convinced my boss that I'd been stealing office supplies and using company resources for personal projects. When I dated a nice man from my church, she told him that I had a history of mental illness and had been hospitalized for suicide attempts. The lies were always plausible, always mixed with just enough truth to be believable. I had been sad after my mother's death. What teenager wouldn't be? I had struggled financially, but because they'd stolen my inheritance, not because I was irresponsible. I had kept to myself socially, but because they'd systematically alienated me from anyone who might have offered support. And in my previous life, I'd been too naive, too trusting, too desperate for their love to see it for what it was. I'd kept trying to prove myself worthy, kept believing that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, succeeded enough, they would finally accept me as family. I'd died still believing that they were capable of love. This time would be different. The first thing I did was get to know Great Aunt Cordelia, and it changed everything. In my previous life, I'd barely known she existed. Elena had made sure of that, intercepting phone calls and hiding letters, claiming that Cordelia never really approved of your father's choice in wives, and that she thinks you're too young to understand her work. I'd accepted these explanations because I'd trusted Elena, because I'd believed that my stepmother had my best interests at heart. This time, I knew better. I found Cordelia in her private research laboratory in Boston, a sprawling complex of state of the art equipment and brilliant minds working on revolutionary cancer treatments. She was 75 years old with sharp blue eyes behind wire rimmed glasses and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a lab coat over expensive clothes, and her office walls were covered with awards, honorary degrees, and photographs of her with world leaders and Nobel Prize winners. When I introduced myself as Margaret Ashworth's daughter, her face lit up with a joy so pure it made my chest ache with the realization of everything I'd been denied. "You look exactly like your mother," she said, tears gathering in her eyes as she stood and pulled me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and laboratory chemicals. "I've been trying to reach you for years. That woman your father married keeps saying you're too busy with school to talk, but I've left so many messages." I spent the next hour listening to stories about my mother that no one had ever told me. How Margaret had been Cordelia's favorite niece, the only one who understood her passion for science and healing. How they'd spent hours discussing research and dreaming about the future of medicine. How Margaret had planned to work with Cordelia after I was old enough to not need constant supervision. She was going to revolutionize pediatric oncology, Cordelia told me, showing me photographs of my mother in a lab coat, looking young and brilliant and determined. She had ideas that were decades ahead of their time. Her death was such a loss to the world, not just to your father and you. I learned that Cordelia had been trying to build a relationship with me since my mother's death, but Elena had systematically intercepted every attempt. Phone calls were never passed along. Letters were thrown away. Invitations to visit were declined on my behalf. "I thought you weren't interested," Cordelia admitted, looking older than her 75 years. "Elena said you blamed me for not being able to save Margaret, that you didn't want reminders of her illness. I respected what I thought were your wishes, but it broke my heart." The more time I spent with Cordelia, the more I understood what I'd lost in my previous life. She wasn't just brilliant and accomplished. She was kind, funny, and absolutely furious when I gradually revealed how Elena had been keeping us apart. "That woman has been stealing from you," she said, her voice shaking with rage after I'd carefully shared some of the financial abuse I'd suffered. "Margaret left you provided for, and that woman has systematically plundered your inheritance while poisoning your relationship with your family." More importantly, Cordelia had no heirs and had been worried about what would happen to her life's work after her death. "The company should stay in Ashworth hands," she told me over dinner in her private penthouse apartment overlooking Boston Harbor. The apartment was like something from a magazine, art from around the world, books in multiple languages, photographs documenting a life of adventure and achievement. But it needs to go to someone worthy, someone who understands what it means to help people rather than just accumulate wealth. She began teaching me about the pharmaceutical industry, about business, about the intricate web of investments and partnerships that made up her empire. I soaked up every lesson like a desperate sponge, knowing that one day I'd need to be worthy of the trust she was placing in me. Cordelia's company wasn't just profitable, it was revolutionary. They'd developed 3 breakthrough cancer treatments in the last decade, had partnerships with research hospitals around the world, and funded scholarships for promising young scientists from underserved communities. The Ashworth Foundation had built hospitals in developing countries and provided free medications to patients who couldn't afford treatment. "Money is just a tool," Cordelia explained as we walked through one of her research facilities, watching brilliant minds work on solutions that could save millions of lives. "The question is what you build with it." Your mother understood that. She wanted to heal the world. I began spending every weekend and school holiday with Cordelia, learning not just about business, but about the kind of person I wanted to become. She introduced me to world-renowned scientists, Nobel laureates, and humanitarian leaders. She showed me that wealth could be a force for good, that success meant more than just accumulating resources. Meanwhile, I played the part of the family disappointment perfectly back home. I let Elena think she was winning, that her systematic destruction of my confidence and opportunities was working. I took the abuse, the insults, the casual cruelty with the resigned acceptance they expected. When Elena sabotaged my internship opportunities by calling my potential employers and sharing concerns about my emotional stability, I pretended to be devastated. When she convinced my father that I was stealing money from his wallet, I accepted his accusations with tears and apologies. When she arranged for Miranda to get the summer job at the country club that I'd applied for, I congratulated my stepsister with what looked like genuine happiness. "You're so good about these disappointments," Elena told me with false sympathy after another manufactured setback. "I'm proud of how mature you're being about accepting your limitations." But I was documenting everything, every lie, every theft, every act of cruelty. I was building a case that would be ironclad when the time came for justice. The years passed in this double life. At home, I was the overlooked daughter, the family failure, the genetic disappointment who would never amount to anything. With Cordelia, I was the brilliant heir to a scientific legacy, learning to run a multinational corporation and make decisions that affected thousands of lives. I watched Miranda bloom under the family's favoritism, becoming more spoiled and entitled by the day. She went to expensive schools where Elena bribed administrators to overlook her academic failures and behavioral problems. She took luxury vacations to Europe and Asia, while I worked part-time jobs to pay for basic necessities. She developed a cocaine habit that Elena covered up by bribing school officials and police officers. Richard spent a fortune on Miranda's every whim while continuing to treat me like a burden he was obligated to house. He bought her a brand new BMW for her 16th birthday and gave me a bus pass. He paid for her to attend private art classes and told me I couldn't afford college. He took her to business conferences and social events while leaving me home to do household chores. And through it all, I waited. I planned. I built relationships with Cordelia's business partners and learned everything I could about running a pharmaceutical empire. I studied human psychology, understanding how manipulators like Elena operated and how to turn their own tactics against them. When I turned 21, I began the most crucial phase of my plan. Meeting James Morrison again was like stepping into a beautiful dream I'd thought I'd lost forever. In my previous life, I'd met him at a charity gala when I was 25. A shy wallflower in a discount dress who couldn't believe someone like him would notice someone like me. He was devastating handsome, incredibly wealthy, and seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about literature and art. Our courtship had been a fairy tale. He was patient with my insecurities, kind about my family's obvious disapproval, and passionate about building a life together. I'd died believing he'd betrayed me, that Miranda's claims about their secret relationship were true. Only in this life did I realize that she'd been lying about that too, that James had been as devastated by my death as I'd been by the discovery of his supposed infidelity. This time, I approached him differently. Instead of being the naive girl desperate for love, I was a confident woman with a clear vision and the resources to achieve it. I attended the same charity gala, but this time I was there as Cordelia's guest and representative, wearing a designer gown and speaking with authority about pharmaceutical research and humanitarian work. James noticed me immediately, but instead of the shy flower he'd fallen for in my previous life, he met a woman who could match him intellectually and professionally. Our conversation that night lasted for hours, covering everything from bioethics to classical music to our shared passion for travel. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he told me as he walked me to my car, a sleek Mercedes that Cordelia had insisted I needed for business purposes. "You're brilliant and beautiful, but there's something else. You seem like you've lived more than someone your age should have." If only he knew. Our courtship this time was a meeting of equals. He took me to exclusive restaurants, and I reciprocated with invitations to Cordelia's research facilities. He introduced me to his business partners, and I shared insights about the pharmaceutical industry that impressed his investment team. He was charmed by my confidence, and I was grateful for his respect. But more than that, I was able to appreciate him in ways I'd been too insecure to manage in my previous life. James Morrison wasn't just handsome and wealthy. He was kind, intelligent, and genuinely committed to using his privilege for good. His hotels employed thousands of people and provided excellent benefits. His foundation built schools in underserved communities and funded educational programs for disadvantaged youth. "I've spent my whole life knowing that I was born lucky," he told me during one of our long conversations about responsibility and privilege. "The question is what you do with luck. Do you hoard it, or do you use it to create more luck for other people?" 6 months into our relationship, I told him about my family's abuse. Everything except the reincarnation part. I explained about the financial theft, the systematic sabotage, the emotional cruelty that had defined my life since Elena entered it. James listened with growing anger and disgust, his jaw tightening as I described how they'd stolen my inheritance and poisoned my father against me. "Why haven't you exposed them?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "With what you've told me, you could have them arrested for fraud and embezzlement." "Because I want them to hang themselves completely," I said honestly. "Elena is smart and manipulative. If I move too early, she'll find a way to make herself the victim and me the villain. I need to wait until she's made mistakes that are impossible to explain away." That's when I told him about my plan for the inheritance, about Cordelia's growing concerns about the future of her company, about the will that was being carefully crafted to ensure justice. "You're playing a long game," he said with something that looked like admiration. "How long have you been planning this?" "Years," I said, which was true even if he couldn't understand the full scope of it. He understood the need for secrecy, for patience, for careful planning. James had seen enough wealthy families destroy each other to recognize the signs of serious dysfunction. He'd also seen enough financial abuse in his social circle to understand how difficult it was to prove and prosecute. "When the time comes," he promised me, "I'll make sure they can never hurt you again." A year into our relationship, he proposed during a quiet dinner at Cordelia's penthouse, with my beloved great aunt as our only witness. The ring was perfect, a vintage sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother. "I've never met anyone like you," he said as he got down on one knee in front of the fireplace where Cordelia had been reading research journals. "You're brilliant and strong, and you see the world the way it should be rather than the way it is. I want to spend my life helping you make that vision real." We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at Cordelia's estate, with only a handful of close friends as witnesses. James understood why we needed to keep our marriage secret until the timing was right for the inheritance plan. He'd seen enough family dramas play out in court to appreciate the value of strategic patience. "Your family is going to be shocked," he said as we danced to music from a string quartet on Cordelia's garden terrace, surrounded by roses and fairy lights. "They're going to be destroyed," I corrected, thinking about the will that Cordelia had signed just the week before. "And they're going to deserve every bit of it." 2 months after our secret wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. The timing was perfect, exactly what we needed for the inheritance clause that Cordelia had written into her will. But more than that, holding the positive pregnancy test in my hands, I felt a joy that transcended any thoughts of revenge or justice. This baby would grow up loved and protected. Valued for exactly who they were rather than what they could provide, this baby would know security and encouragement and unconditional acceptance. This baby would have everything I'd been denied in both of my lives. That's when I knew it was time for the most crucial deception of all. The fake infertility diagnosis required more planning and resources than any other part of my revenge, but it was absolutely essential to the psychological warfare I was waging against my family. I'd learned enough about Elena's psychology over the years to understand that her greatest fear was losing control, losing the power she'd built through manipulation and lies. She'd spent decades positioning Miranda as the golden child, the chosen heir, the daughter who deserved everything I'd been denied. The idea that I might produce an heir, especially one that would legally supersede Miranda's claim to anything, would be devastating to her carefully constructed narrative. So I had to convince them, beyond any shadow of doubt, that I was genetically incapable of reproduction. Finding a doctor willing to falsify medical records wasn't as difficult as I'd expected. Dr. Marcus Hendricks was a disgraced physician who'd lost his license for insurance fraud, but still had access to official forms and medical equipment through a black market network that catered to people with very specific needs. "You want me to diagnose you with severe endometriosis and scarring that makes natural conception impossible," he repeated, reading from the notes I'd provided. "And you want documentation that looks completely legitimate. I want medical records that would convince any insurance company, any family court, any suspicious relative," I confirmed, handing him an envelope containing $50,000 in cash. "Complete with test results, specialist consultations, and a prognosis that makes pregnancy seem medically impossible." Dr. Hendricks was thorough, I'll give him that. He created a complete medical history showing multiple consultations with fertility specialists, invasive tests revealing extensive scarring, and treatment attempts that had failed. The documentation was flawless. It would have fooled real doctors, let alone my suspicious family. The appointment itself was a masterpiece of performance art. I'd practiced my devastated reaction for weeks, perfecting the right balance of shock, grief, and resignation that would sell the deception completely. "I'm sorry, Miss Ashworth," Dr. Hendricks said, his voice carefully neutral as he delivered the fabricated news in his rented office space. "The tests show severe endometriosis with extensive scarring throughout your reproductive system. Your chances of natural conception are essentially zero." I buried my face in my hands, letting out a convincing sob that came easily when I thought about all the real devastation my family had caused me over the years. But I always wanted children. There has to be something you can do. "IVF might be theoretically possible," he said, following the script we'd rehearsed. "But even then, the success rate would be extremely low, less than 5%. And the emotional and financial cost of repeated failures, I'm very sorry." I drove home in carefully orchestrated devastation, stopping at a grocery store to rub onions on my eyes until they were red and swollen. I needed to look like I'd been crying for hours. Eliana was in the sitting room with Miranda when I walked in, both of them pretending to read magazines while obviously waiting for news about my appointment. The family tension around my potential fertility had been building for weeks, ever since I'd mentioned seeing a doctor about some irregular symptoms that had them all on edge. "Well?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested she was hoping for bad news. "I can't have children," I whispered, my voice breaking in exactly the right places. "The doctor says it's impossible. There's too much scarring." The relief that washed over Elena's features was stunning in its intensity. She actually smiled before catching herself and rearranging her expression into something that might have passed for sympathy if you didn't know her well. "Oh, darling," she said, standing to give me a hug that felt like being embraced by a spider. "I'm so sorry, but maybe this is for the best. You've always been so focused on your career, and children are such a responsibility." Miranda actually clapped her hands together before covering it with a cough. "I mean, I'm sorry for your loss," she said, not bothering to hide her glee. "But Elena's right. You're probably not really the maternal type anyway." My father, when he came home and heard the news, patted my shoulder awkwardly and said, "Well, that's probably for the best, Sophia. You don't exactly have the stability for motherhood. At least now we don't have to worry about you making any rash decisions." That night, I heard them celebrating in the main dining room. Elena had opened a bottle of champagne, Dom Perignon, the same brand she'd served at her wedding to my father. I crept up from my basement room and listened at the door, recording everything on my phone for future use. "Thank God," Elena was saying, her voice bright with relief and satisfaction. "Now we don't have to worry about her accidentally producing some heir that could complicate things later. Everything will go to Miranda, as it should." "I can't believe how lucky we got," Miranda added, and I could hear the clink of champagne glasses. "Imagine if she'd been able to have kids. We'd have had to deal with her spawn for decades." Richard's voice was quieter, but still audible. "It's really better this way. The Ashworth name needs to continue through someone worthy. Miranda will do honor to the family legacy." They toasted to my infertility, to their secure future, to the complete destruction of any threat I might have posed to their plans. They celebrated the idea that the family line would end with me, that I would die alone and childless, while Miranda inherited everything they'd stolen from me. If they only knew that at that very moment, I was carrying the next generation of Ashworth blood, carefully hidden beneath loose clothing and strategic timing. Over the next few years, I played my part perfectly. I dated occasionally, but never seriously, always allowing Elena to sabotage my relationships with carefully planted stories about my fertility issues and how they were emotionally devastating for any man who wanted children. "It's such a shame," she would tell my dates' mothers at social events. "Sophia's infertility has made her quite unstable. She becomes obsessed with other people's children, and it makes men very uncomfortable." I watched my romantic prospects evaporate one by one, exactly as Elena intended, but I didn't mind. I was married to the love of my life, carrying his child and planning the most spectacular revenge in family history. Meanwhile, Miranda bloomed under the family's favoritism like a poisonous flower. She went to expensive schools where Elena's donations ensured her academic failures were overlooked. She took luxury vacations to Europe and Asia, posting endless social media photos of herself in designer clothes and exotic locations. She developed a cocaine habit that started at prep school and escalated through college, funded by the money Elena had stolen from my inheritance. Elena covered up Miranda's addiction with the same skills she'd used to destroy my reputation. Police officers were bribed to look the other way when Miranda was caught with drugs. School administrators received generous donations that coincidentally preceded their decisions to give Miranda second chances rather than expulsions. Rehab facilities were paid handsomely to maintain strict confidentiality about her repeated stays. Miranda is going through a difficult phase, Elena would explain to anyone who asked about her daughter's erratic behavior. She's very sensitive, very artistic. Sometimes creative people need different outlets for their emotions. Richard spent a fortune on Miranda's every whim, while continuing to treat me like a financial burden he was obligated to support. He bought her a brand new Porsche for her 21st birthday and reminded me that I should be grateful for my bus pass. He paid for her to attend an expensive art program in Paris and told me I couldn't afford graduate school. He took her to business conferences and charity galas, while I stayed home to do household chores that Elena assigned with increasing frequency and specificity. I became the family servant in everything but name. I cooked meals that I wasn't invited to eat, cleaned rooms I wasn't allowed to use, and organized social events I wasn't welcome to attend. Elena justified this by claiming that everyone needs to contribute to the household, and that my contributions were more practical than financial, since I was clearly not career-oriented. The irony was that during this same period, I was being groomed to run an $800 million pharmaceutical empire. Cordelia continued my education in earnest, bringing me to board meetings, introducing me to key executives, and gradually shifting more responsibilities to me as her health began to decline. By the time I was 25, I was essentially functioning as her deputy, making decisions about research funding, approving new drug trials, and representing Ashworth Pharmaceuticals at international conferences. "You have your mother's mind for this work," Cordelia told me after I'd successfully negotiated a partnership with a European research consortium that would bring our cancer treatments to millions of new patients. "Margaret would be so proud of the woman you've become." I was living two completely different lives, and the contrast was staggering. At home, I was the failure daughter who couldn't even manage to get married or hold down a decent job. At Ashworth Pharmaceuticals, I was the brilliant heir apparent who was revolutionizing cancer treatment and building partnerships that would save countless lives. Eliana had no idea that the daughter she dismissed as worthless was regularly making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of patients worldwide. She had no idea that I was being courted by heads of state, offered positions at major universities, and featured in business magazines as one of the most promising young executives in the pharmaceutical industry. The cognitive dissonance would have been amusing if it weren't so infuriating, but I endured it all, documenting every slight, every theft, every act of cruelty. I was building a case that would be absolutely ironclad when the time came for justice. More importantly, I was building the skills and relationships I would need to honor Cordelia's legacy when I inherited her empire. When I turned 26 and married James in secret, my family remained completely oblivious. They were too busy planning Miranda's engagement to a trust fund baby whose family's money came from oil investments and defense contracting, exactly the kind of morally bankrupt wealth that appealed to Elena's sensibilities. "Miranda is going to be so happy," Elena gushed to her friends at the country club, not knowing I was serving drinks at the charity luncheon where she was holding court. "Trevor's family has such connections, such influence. They'll be able to open doors that would never be available to someone like, well, someone less fortunate." The someone less fortunate was clearly a reference to me, the daughter who was approaching 30 with no husband, no children, and no apparent prospects for either. If only they knew that I was already married to a man whose wealth dwarfed Trevor's family fortune, carrying a child who would inherit everything they'd spent decades trying to steal. When I discovered I was pregnant 8 months after our secret wedding, I spent an entire day in Cordelia's garden, just sitting among the roses and thinking about the future. This baby would grow up knowing love, security, and unconditional acceptance. This baby would never question their worth or wonder if they deserved good things. This baby would be raised by parents who understood that privilege was a responsibility, not just an advantage. Are you ready for this? Cordelia asked, finding me there as the sun was setting over the harbor. She was frailer than she'd been even 6 months earlier, and we both knew that her time was growing short. I'm ready, I said, placing my hand over my still flat stomach. This baby is going to inherit a world where justice actually exists. That's when Cordelia made the final changes to her will, adding the clause that would ensure my complete victory over the people who had destroyed my previous life and tried to destroy this one. The inheritance will go to the first blood-related Ashworth descendant to produce a legitimate heir within 6 months of my death, she dictated to her lawyer, her voice strong despite her declining health. If no such heir is produced within that time frame, the entire estate will be donated to cancer research foundations. It was perfect. Elena's family had been so confident in my infertility that they'd never even considered the possibility that I might produce an heir. They'd spent years celebrating my barrenness, toasting to their secure future, planning how to spend money that would never be theirs. 3 months later, when Cordelia passed away peacefully in her sleep with me holding her hand, the stage was set for the most spectacular family drama in recent memory. The morning of the will reading, I dressed with the care of a general preparing for the decisive battle of a long war. I chose a loose cashmere sweater in dove gray that would conceal my 5-month pregnancy bump, paired with dark slacks and low heels that wouldn't draw attention to any changes in my silhouette. My hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, and I wore the pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, a subtle reminder of the Ashworth heritage that Elena had tried so hard to erase. James had wanted to come with me for emotional support, but we'd agreed that revealing our marriage at the same time as the pregnancy and inheritance would be too much shock for one day. Instead, he waited in the lawyer's reception area, ready to make his entrance at exactly the right moment. Elena and Miranda had dressed for a celebration. Elena wore a burgundy silk dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with the diamond necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, another piece of family heritage that she'd claimed as her own. Miranda was resplendent in designer everything, from her imported shoes to her professionally styled hair. They looked like they were attending a coronation, which in their minds they essentially were. My father wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to marry Elena 15 years earlier. He looked older than his 62 years, the weight of guilt and poor choices etched into the lines around his eyes. But there was anticipation there, too. The expectation that finally, the right daughter would receive the recognition and resources she deserved. The lawyer's office was oppressive with its dark wood paneling and heavy furniture designed to intimidate and impress. Mr. Peterson was a distinguished man in his 70s who had been Cordelia's attorney for over 30 years. He knew the family history, understood the dynamics at play, and had been carefully briefed on what to expect from this reading. Before we begin, he said, adjusting his glasses and looking at each of us in turn, I want to be clear that this will was drafted with Mrs. Ashworth's full mental faculties intact, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and is legally uncontestable. Any challenges to its provisions will result in automatic forfeiture of all benefits. Elena nodded confidently, reaching over to squeeze Miranda's hand. They'd obviously discussed the possibility of me trying to cause trouble, but they were secure in their assumption that there was nothing I could do to threaten Miranda's inheritance. The will contains several specific bequests, Mr. Peterson continued, followed by the disposition of the main estate. Let me begin with the smaller items. He read through a list of charitable donations: $50 million to cancer research, $20 million to educational foundations, $10 million to environmental causes. Elena fidgeted impatiently through these, clearly eager to get to the main event. To my longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, I leave my personal jewelry collection and a cash bequest of $5 million, along with my gratitude for 40 years of loyal service. Mr. Peterson looked up from the document. Mrs. Chen is in Hong Kong visiting family, but has been notified of this bequest. Miranda's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of $5 million going to the help, but Elena squeezed her hand in reminder to stay focused on the bigger picture. To my research assistant, Dr. Sarah Williams, I leave my personal library and laboratory equipment, along with a cash bequest of $10 million to continue her groundbreaking work in pediatric oncology. Now Elena was starting to look concerned about the amounts being distributed. but she clearly assumed these were just preliminary gifts before the real inheritance was announced. And now, Mr. Peterson said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, for the disposition of the primary estate. The room went silent. Miranda leaned forward in her chair, Elena's grip on her hand tightening until her knuckles went white. My father sat perfectly still, barely breathing. I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including Ashworth Pharmaceuticals, all real properties, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $800 million, to the first blood-related Ashworth descendant to produce a legitimate heir within 6 months of my death. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the antique clock ticking on Mr. Peterson's desk. I watched Elena's face cycle through confusion, calculation, and growing horror as the implications began to sink in. Blood-related, she repeated slowly, her voice barely a whisper. That's correct, Mr. Peterson confirmed. The inheritance must go to someone who shares genetic heritage with the Ashworth family line. In this case, that would be Miss Sophia Ashworth, as the only living blood descendant of childbearing age. But she can't have children, Elena said, her voice getting stronger and more desperate. She's infertile. Multiple doctors confirmed it. The medical records are clear. Miranda was staring at me with growing suspicion, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face for any sign that I might be hiding something. The will does not specify that the descendant must currently have children, Mr. Peterson explained patiently. It states that the inheritance goes to the first to produce an heir within 6 months. If no heir is produced within that time frame, the entire estate will be donated to cancer research foundations. Richard found his voice, though it came out as a croak. But Sophia, the doctors said... This was my moment. I stood slowly, placing both hands over my stomach in a gesture that made my 5-month pregnancy unmistakable. Actually, I said, my voice calm and clear in the shocked silence, I'm 5 months pregnant. The baby is due in February, well within the 6-month deadline. The explosion that followed was everything I'd hoped for and more. Elena shot to her feet like she'd been electrocuted, her face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked almost like panic. That's impossible. You can't be pregnant. The doctor said it was medically impossible. Dr. Hendricks said what I paid him to say, I replied calmly, enjoying the way her face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. Turns out medical records can be falsified if you know the right people and have enough money. Miranda made a sound like a wounded animal, her hand flying to her throat. You lying, scheming bitch. You planned this. You've been planning this for years. Actually, I've been planning this for lifetimes, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. But the shock on their faces told me they understood exactly what I meant, even if they couldn't quite believe it. Ever since you poisoned me the first time. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena sank back into her chair as if her legs had given out, her face completely white except for 2 bright red spots on her cheeks. That's not possible, she whispered. You're dead. We killed you. I watched you die. You killed a version of me, I agreed, feeling a strange sense of peace at finally speaking the truth. But apparently the universe thought that was unfair. So, here I am, with 16 years of memories about exactly what kind of people you are. Mr. Peterson was staring at us in alarm, clearly not understanding the subtext, but recognizing confessions when he heard them. I smiled at him reassuringly. Don't worry, Mr. Peterson. They're just upset about losing $800 million. People say strange things when they're in shock. But Mr. Peterson was a smart man who had been practicing law for over 40 years. He'd quietly pressed the record button on his phone when Elena mentioned killing me, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed what he'd just heard. Mrs. Ashworth, he said carefully, did you just confess to murdering Miss Ashworth? Elena realized her mistake immediately, but it was too late. The words were out there, recorded, witnessed. No, that's not... She's clearly having some kind of mental breakdown, Elena stammered, looking around desperately for support. She's always been unstable. The pregnancy hormones are obviously affecting her judgment. Actually, said a familiar voice from the doorway, I think her judgment is perfectly clear. James stepped into the room, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit and carrying a small recording device that had obviously been running during the entire meeting. James Morrison, he introduced himself with a slight bow toward Mr. Peterson. Sophia's husband. We married 8 months ago, though we kept it private until the inheritance was settled. If Elena had looked shocked before, she now looked like she might faint. Husband? She gasped. The baby you were just threatening is my child, James continued pleasantly, his tone conversational despite the steel underneath. And I have to say, the confession of murder you just provided is going to make the criminal charges much easier to prove. Richard had gone completely gray, his hands shaking, as the full implications of what was happening finally hit him. His wife and stepdaughter had murdered his biological daughter, and somehow, impossibly, I'd come back for revenge. This is insane, Miranda said, her voice shrill with desperation. She's making all of this up. The pregnancy is probably fake, too. That's when I pulled out my phone and showed them the ultrasound photo James and I had taken just the week before. A perfect little baby in profile, clearly alive and growing inside me. Cordelia Grace Morrison, I said, watching their faces as I revealed the name we'd chosen. Due February 14th. She's going to grow up knowing exactly what kind of people you are, and she's going to use her inheritance to make sure no other children suffer the way I did. Elena made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Richard, she pleaded, turning to my father with tears in her eyes. She's your daughter. You can't let her destroy our family like this. My father looked at me with eyes full of regret and something that might have been recognition. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the man who used to read me bedtime stories and teach me to ride a bike, before Elena's poison had turned him against his own child. I destroyed our family the day I chose them over you, he said quietly, his voice breaking. Maybe this is justice. Maybe this is what I deserve for failing your mother's memory so completely. Miranda lunged toward me then, her face twisted with rage and desperation, but James caught her wrist effortlessly. I wouldn't recommend that, he said pleasantly, his grip clearly causing her pain without being visible to observers. Security cameras are recording, and assault charges would really complicate your already precarious legal situation. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, clearly eager to conclude what had become a very unusual will reading. If there are no other questions about the will's provisions, I believe we can conclude this meeting. Mrs. Morrison, congratulations on your inheritance. The transition paperwork will be ready for your signature next week. As we prepared to leave, Elena made one final desperate plea. Sophia, please, she said, her voice broken and pathetic in a way I'd never heard before. We raised you. We gave you a home, a family. We loved you. I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about the years of abuse, the stolen inheritance, the systematic destruction of every relationship and opportunity I'd tried to build. You gave me sleeping in a converted maid's room while Miranda got the master suite, I said quietly. You gave me working 3 jobs to pay for college while you spent my inheritance on Miranda's private school. You gave me watching my father choose his new family over his own daughter every single day for 16 years. I paused at the door, looking back at the 3 people who had made both of my lives a living hell. But most importantly, you gave me the motivation to become someone worthy of $800 million. So thank you for that. Elena's sobs followed us out of the building, but I felt nothing but relief. The first phase of my revenge was complete. Now came the really satisfying part, watching their carefully constructed world crumble around them, and the next 6 months were a masterclass in systematic destruction, and I found myself enjoying every moment of it with a satisfaction that probably should have concerned me more than it did. The first thing I did was hire a team of forensic accountants and criminal investigators to trace every penny Elena's family had stolen from me over the years. What they found was even worse than I'd expected. My mother's trust fund, originally worth over $3 million, had been completely drained through a series of loans to Elena's relatives and investments in businesses that had mysteriously failed within months of receiving the money. The college fund that should have paid for Harvard and graduate school had been redirected to Miranda's private school tuition, her art classes, her therapy sessions, and her multiple rehab stays. But the really damning evidence came from the credit cards and loans that had been taken out in my name while I was away at college. Elena had somehow gained access to my social security number and had opened accounts that racked up hundreds of thousands in debt. Debt that had been destroying my credit rating for years while funding Miranda's lifestyle. This isn't just family financial abuse, my lead attorney explained during our first strategy meeting. This is identity theft on a massive scale, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. We're looking at federal charges that could put all three of them away for decades. Not yet, I said, reviewing the evidence files with growing satisfaction. I want them to suffer a little first. Let them think they might be able to fight this. Because the beautiful thing about Elena was that she was constitutionally incapable of admitting defeat. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, even knowing that I now controlled an $800 million empire, she was convinced she could manipulate her way out of consequences. She started with a charm offensive, sending me flowers and handwritten letters expressing her regret for any misunderstandings and her excitement about becoming a grandmother. The letters were masterpieces of manipulation, carefully crafted to make her seem like a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of years of abuse. Dearest Sophia, one letter read, I know things have been difficult between us, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman's mistakes. I was only trying to do what I thought was best for the family. Perhaps we could have lunch and discuss how to move forward in a way that honors your dear mother's memory. I kept every letter, but I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I had my investigators dig deeper into Elena's background, and what they found was illuminating. She'd done this before. Elena Rodriguez, her maiden name, which she'd conveniently dropped after marrying my father, had been married twice before Richard. Her first husband, a wealthy contractor, had died in a mysterious accident 6 months after changing his will to include her teenage daughter from a previous marriage. Her second husband, a successful restaurateur, had lost everything in a series of bad investments that Elena had encouraged, eventually dying of a stress-induced heart attack while Elena and her daughter lived in luxury. She's a serial predator, my investigator reported. She targets grieving widowers with assets and young children who might inherit. The pattern is always the same. She positions herself as the solution to their problems, then systematically isolates them from their biological children while transferring assets to her own offspring. Miranda, it turned out, wasn't even Elena's biological daughter. She was the child of Elena's first victim, adopted and raised to be the perfect accomplice in her mother's schemes. The real Miranda Rodriguez had died in a car accident at age 12. The woman I'd grown up with was actually Cassandra Williams, a troubled teenager Elena had taken in from the foster system and trained to play the role of the grieving daughter. The web of lies was so complex, so carefully constructed, that it took weeks to unravel. But every revelation made the criminal case stronger and my resolve firmer. Meanwhile, Elena's family was self-destructing in spectacular fashion. Elena had quit her job at the charity foundation the moment she thought Miranda would inherit Cordelia's fortune, assuming she'd never need to work again. Now she was scrambling to find employment while facing the reality that her daughter would inherit nothing. But her reputation in philanthropic circles was already damaged by whispers about her treatment of me, and potential employers were reluctant to hire someone whose family dynamics were becoming the subject of local gossip. Richard's consulting business was failing because his wealthy clients were distancing themselves from the family that had raised such a manipulative daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were blaming him for my supposed deception when the real deception had been theirs all along. But Miranda, or Cassandra, as I'd started thinking of her, was having the most spectacular breakdown. Without the security of knowing she'd inherit millions, without Elena's constant validation and protection, she was falling apart in very public ways. Her social media became a constant stream of increasingly unhinged posts about how I'd stolen her inheritance through lies and manipulation. Sophia Ashworth is a liar and a fraud, one post read. She faked being infertile for years just to steal what rightfully belongs to me. She's been plotting against our family since we took her in out of charity. Now she's claiming to be pregnant just to get money that should go to the real daughter who actually deserves it. Her friends were abandoning her one by one, as the truth about our family dynamics became public knowledge. The cocaine habit that Elena had covered up for years was now impossible to hide, making her unemployable in any respectable position. The really satisfying part was watching Elena lose control of the narrative she'd spent years constructing. For the first time in decades, people were hearing my side of the story, and they were horrified by what they learned. I had no idea Sophia was being treated like that. Mrs. Whitman from the country club told a friend, not knowing I was within earshot at a charity luncheon I was attending as the new head of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals. Elena always made it sound like Sophia was difficult and ungrateful. But if even half of what's coming out is true, making her live in the basement while Miranda got the master suite? Her friend replied, stealing her inheritance to pay for private school? I mean, I always thought Elena was a bit cold, but this is monstrous. The social ostracism was swift and brutal. Elena's invitations to exclusive events dried up overnight. Miranda found herself blocked from social media groups and excluded from gatherings she'd attended for years. Richard was quietly dropped from business organizations and charitable boards. But the real justice was yet to come. 3 months after the will reading, James's security team, which had been quietly investigating my family's criminal activities, presented their findings to the FBI. The evidence was overwhelming: financial fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The attempted murder charge was based on the recording of Elena's confession during the will reading, combined with forensic evidence from my previous life that had been preserved in police files as an unexplained death case. The arrests happened on a cold Tuesday morning in March, just 2 weeks before my daughter was due to be born. I watched from the comfort of my new penthouse apartment, the one that had belonged to Cordelia, now redecorated with a nursery that looked like something from a fairy tale. James held me as we watched the news coverage of Elena being led away in handcuffs, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled from struggling against the officers. Miranda fought the arrest with typical drama, screaming about how this was all my fault, how I'd destroyed their lives out of jealousy and spite. The footage of her being dragged to a police car while hurling accusations at the news cameras would become a viral sensation within hours. Richard went quietly, his shoulders shaking with sobs that I felt nothing about. He'd made his choices 16 years ago when he decided that his new wife's happiness was more important than his daughter's well-being. That afternoon, I called Dr. Rodriguez, my real obstetrician, who had been monitoring my pregnancy with the care and attention that a woman carrying an $800 million heir deserved. "Mrs. Morrison," she said warmly when she saw my name on her caller ID. "How are you feeling? Any concerns about the baby?" "Everything's perfect," I assured her, watching James review the criminal trial schedule with our legal team. "The baby's healthy, I'm healthy, and my family just learned what happens when you try to destroy an Ashworth woman." She chuckled, having heard enough of my story during our appointments to understand the significance of the day's events. "Justice has a funny way of working itself out, doesn't it?" "Eventually," I agreed. "I'll see you next week for the final checkup." That evening, James and I sat in Cordelia's, now our, study, surrounded by the awards and photographs documenting her incredible life. I was reading through her private journals again, learning about the woman who'd become the mother figure I'd never had. In her final entry, dated just a week before her death, she'd written, "Sophia reminds me so much of Margaret at that age. Brilliant, resilient, and capable of turning pain into purpose. I know she'll use this inheritance to build something beautiful. The Ashworth legacy is safe in her hands, and I can rest knowing that justice will finally be served." "She never knew about the reincarnation," I murmured to James, feeling our daughter move restlessly inside me, as if she could sense the importance of the moment. But somehow, she understood that I deserved a second chance. James kissed my temple, his hand resting over mine on my swollen belly. "Our daughter is going to grow up in a world where she's loved and protected and valued for exactly who she is. That's the real inheritance you're giving her." Our daughter, Cordelia Grace Morrison, named for the woman who'd saved us both and due to arrive any day now. The trial began when Cordy was 3 months old, and it was everything I'd hoped for and more. Elena received 25 years for murder, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just the confession we'd recorded, but forensic evidence that had been preserved from my previous death, financial records showing the systematic theft of my inheritance, and testimony from dozens of witnesses who had seen the abuse over the years. Miranda, whose real name we learned during the trial was indeed Cassandra Williams, received 18 years for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The revelation that she wasn't even Elena's biological daughter, but rather a foster child who had been trained to participate in these schemes, added another layer of tragedy to an already sordid story. Richard received 12 years and lost his business license permanently. His sentence was lighter because he'd cooperated with investigators once the truth came out, providing detailed testimony about Elena's manipulation and control over their household. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, holding my 3-month-old daughter in my arms as I told the court about the systematic abuse, the stolen inheritance, and the murder that had ended my previous life. The image of me, young, successful, holding my baby while describing years of cruelty, was impossible for the jury to ignore. "Did you ever consider forgiving them?" the defense attorney asked during cross-examination, clearly hoping to make me seem vindictive. "Every day," I answered honestly, adjusting Cordy's blanket as she slept peacefully in my arms. "But forgiveness doesn't mean allowing abuse to continue. My daughter deserves to grow up knowing that actions have consequences, that cruelty and greed are punished, and that good people can win if they're smart enough and strong enough to fight back." Elena screamed at me from the defendant's table when the verdict was read. "You destroyed everything. We loved you. We gave you everything." "No," I said quietly, standing to address her directly for the last time. "You destroyed yourselves. I just made sure the world could see it." The judge sentenced Elena to serve her time in a maximum security facility with no possibility of parole for 20 years. Miranda would be eligible for parole in 12 years, but given her history of violence and addiction, it was unlikely she'd be released early. Richard would serve his time in a minimum security facility and would likely be out in 8 years if he continued to cooperate. As they were led away in shackles, I felt a sense of closure that I'd been carrying across 2 lifetimes. Justice had been served, wrongs had been righted, and, most importantly, the cycle of abuse had been broken forever. Cordelia Grace Morrison was born on February 14th, exactly 7 months after Great-Aunt Cordelia's death and well within the inheritance deadline. She came into the world healthy and perfect, with tiny fists and her great-great-aunt's determined blue eyes and her father's strong chin. James cried when he held her for the first time. This powerful man who commanded respect in boardrooms around the world, reduced to tears by the miracle of his tiny daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's going to change the world." I knew he was right. Our daughter would grow up with every advantage. Not just money, but love, support, and the knowledge that she was valued for exactly who she was. She'd learn about her grandmother Margaret's scientific brilliance, about Great-Aunt Cordelia's humanitarian legacy, about the importance of using privilege to help others. But she'd also learn about justice, about standing up to bullies, about the fact that sometimes the universe gives you exactly the tools you need to fight back, if you're smart enough and strong enough to use them. 6 months after Cordy's birth, I officially took over as CEO of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals. The company was thriving under my leadership, having announced several breakthrough treatments and expanded our charitable foundation to fund research hospitals in underserved communities around the world. My first major initiative was the Margaret Ashworth Institute for Pediatric Cancer Research, a state-of-the-art facility that would carry on my mother's legacy of healing children. The second was the Cordelia Foundation for Foster Care Reform, dedicated to preventing the kind of exploitation that had turned Cassandra Williams into Miranda Rodriguez. "Every child deserves to be protected," I told the board during my first official meeting as CEO. "Every child deserves to know they're valued. That's not just our corporate responsibility, it's our moral obligation." The foundation had already funded 3 breakthrough treatments and built 2 new research facilities. We'd also implemented new protocols for investigating potential abuse in wealthy families, working with social services to ensure that no other children would suffer the way I had. Elena sent letters from prison, rambling, manipulative screeds that blamed me for destroying the family and demanded money for her commissary account. I kept them as evidence of her continued narcissism, but never responded. Miranda's letters were more unhinged, filled with conspiracy theories about how I'd planned everything from birth and demanding that I visit her to explain how you faked your own death. The fact that she still couldn't accept responsibility for her actions was both predictable and pathetic. Richard's letters were the hardest to read, filled with genuine remorse and acknowledgement of what he'd lost. He wrote about my mother, about the daughter he remembered before Elena's poison had turned him against me, about the grandfather he wanted to be if I would ever let him meet Cordy. I kept those letters too, but I didn't answer them. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. But I made sure he received photos of Cordy on her birthday and holidays, not out of forgiveness, but because I wanted him to see exactly what his choices had cost him. 2 years after the trial, James and I bought a house in the mountains of Vermont, a sprawling estate where Cordy could grow up with fresh air and room to run. The house had a laboratory where I could continue my research, a library where James could work on his humanitarian projects, and gardens where Cordy could learn to love growing things. We filled our home with friends who loved us for who we were rather than what we could give them. Scientists and teachers, artists and social workers, people who understood that wealth was a tool for building a better world rather than just accumulating power. On Cordy's third birthday, we had a celebration in what had once been Cordelia's garden, now our garden, maintained in memory of the woman who'd saved us both. The roses she'd planted were blooming magnificently, filling the air with their sweet scent. Our daughter ran between the flower beds in her party dress, giggling as she chased butterflies and collected flowers for her grandmother's portrait. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked that evening as we cleaned up after the party, Cordy finally asleep after an exhausting day of celebration. The revenge, I mean, making them pay so completely. I watched our daughter sleep in her beautiful nursery, surrounded by toys and books and evidence of unconditional love. She'd never know what it felt like to be unloved, to question her worth, to wonder if she deserved good things. "No," I said finally. "They made their choices. I just made sure those choices had consequences." That night, as I tucked Cordy into her bed, I whispered the same promise I'd been making since the day she was born. "You'll never doubt that you're loved," I told her, smoothing her dark hair. "You'll never question whether you deserve happiness. You'll grow up knowing that you're precious and valued and protected. And you'll use that security to protect other people." She grabbed my finger with her tiny fist, her blue eyes, so much like Cordelia's, looking up at me with perfect trust. I'd been given a second chance at life, and I'd used it to build something beautiful. Justice had been served, wrongs had been righted, and most importantly, the cycle of abuse had been broken forever. The Ashworth legacy was secure in the hands of someone who would honor it, and my family, my real family, the one built on love rather than obligation, was safe and whole and happy. It had taken 2 lifetimes, but I'd finally won. 5 years later, as I watched Cordy start her first day of school, confident and loved and ready to take on the world, I knew that my mother and great-aunt Cordelia would be proud of what we'd built. The little girl who'd once slept in a basement room, who'd been told she was worthless and unwanted, had become a woman who could change the world, and our daughter would change it even more.